Welcome to Story Power, a bi-monthly podcast where my guests and I chat about stories and creativity in all different styles and formats. My name is Lucinda Sage-Midgorden, and my goal is to promote what Dale Carnegie stated in his famous book, How to Win Friends and Influence People. He said, instead of condemning people, let's try to understand them. Let's try to figure out why they do what they do. That's a lot more profitable and intriguing than criticism, and it breeds sympathy, tolerance, and kindness. To know all is to forgive all. It's my firm belief that the goal of most creative people is to try to understand themselves and others. That's what makes artwork of all kinds so compelling. But more than that, the personal stories of my guests promote understanding as well. Roger C. Schenck, a cognitive scientist, said, human beings are not ideally set up to understand logic. They are ideally set up to understand stories. It's my hope that Story Power will help us understand each other better by sharing the stories of my guests. Hello. Today is episode 123, and I'm talking to Dr. Constance Scharff, and she is an author, among other things. So, yes. Constance, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me.
And I want you to tell about your books because they sound really interesting. I haven't had a chance to read any of them yet.
Okay, well, you have an opportunity. They're all for sale.
Yes, I'm really behind on reading the books of my guests because usually I get them as a guest and then I find out about all their books and it's like, oh, I didn't get to read their book. So tell about your writing.
By training, I'll start here. By training, I am a researcher in mental health, and I started my career in researching at the intersection of addiction and trauma. And over the last 20 years, I've really transitioned into trauma related to climate change. And there's a lot of reasons for that. So my nonfiction books, I have two of them. Both of them have won a whole bunch of awards. The first one was an Amazon #1 bestseller. And those are about complementary methods of treating addiction and trauma. The most recent one is the book Rock to Recovery, Music as a Catalyst for Human Transformation. And it's about how using music, particularly playing music and singing, listening to music has different effects, but how playing music and singing improves mental health. I also write fiction and poetry using my Hebrew name, Ahuva Batya, same last name. And my debut novel, The Path to God's Promise, is just out. And it's about a contemporary Jewish woman who is called by God, she talks to God on a regular basis, to warn human beings about climate change. She's called to be a prophet. And so it is my opportunity to dive into climate change from a fictional perspective, to look at the what ifs, to look at why we change, why we don't change, and what some of the possible outcomes are, whether we take this course or that. So those are my books.
Oh, that sounds great. Now, your first book, though, wasn't that Ending Addiction for Good?
Ending Addiction for Good is the first book that I wrote. It was originally published in 2012 with a second edition in 2014. And it, back in the late 1990s, early 2000s, addiction treatment was pretty much a 12-step model. We used to call it the $30,000 big book. The big book is the main text of Alcoholics Anonymous. So if you went to rehab or you didn't, either way, you were learning a 12-step program. What we learned in addiction treatment and research is that if you add complementary therapies, so things other than talk therapies, to addiction treatment, it greatly improves outcomes. And there are a whole bunch of neurological reasons for that. So ending addiction for good, I worked for a treatment facility in Malibu, and this was one of the addiction treatment facilities that was doing this very early. And so I wrote about that, showcased several different, many different actually complementary therapies, and then went around the world as a keynote speaker to talk about addiction treatment. Now, in the mid 20s, this is, pro forma. Everybody, not everyone, but most addiction treatment facilities use a whole host of complementary therapies but we were the pioneers of that with ending addiction for good.
Oh, wow. So what are some of the complementary treatments?
So
methodologies or whatever you call
what
it?
you want to do, think about it like this. If we knew, if the problem of addiction was the drugs, when we separate you from the drugs, you should immediately get better. That is never the case. The person always becomes psychologically fragile. But if you get bitten by a snake, the problem is the venom. The problem is the snake bite, because then when we give you the anti-venom, you immediately get better.
Right.
So we know that there is a psychological and neurological process that's going on. But if you go to treatment, to rehab, and you talk about your problems, whether in individual or group therapy all day long, and you hear in group the same people complaining about the same things, you lose your mind. You can't do it. So what we've learned from complementary therapies is that if we can get the brain to fire in different ways, it breaks up the obsessive thought process, because one of the biggest problems with addiction is the obsessive thinking. See, when I'm drinking, so this upcoming Saturday, I actually celebrate 26 years of complete and total abstinence from drugs and alcohol.
Wow.
And so I know this firsthand. I get it when I research it. I'm like, oh, I know exactly what you're talking about when I talk to a research subject. And but it's the obsessive thinking. So when I'm drinking, it's not just the time that I'm pouring the liquor down my gullet that is the problem. But when I don't have it, I'm like, okay, I've got to go to work. How am I going to get to work? I need a couple of drinks to get me in the car, and then I have to get there. And I, worked for a child nonprofit, so you can't drink there. So can we go to lunch, and can I have a drink at lunch? And I always wanted to go to Mexican food because I could get margarita and it kind of be on the little bit on the DL, as opposed to Chinese food. You're just out of luck, right? So so it's the thought process. So what we're doing with these different therapeutics is we're breaking up that obsessive thought process. So so there's all sorts of things. We did everything from hyperbaric chambers, right? Oxygen, hyperoxygenation is wonderful. There's drama and storytelling, which are very good for trauma. There's somatic experiencing, which is extremely good for trauma. The other thing that we learned in the addiction treatment is initially, back when I got sober in the 90s, you treated trauma and addiction separately. Doesn't work very well. You have to treat them concurrently. You get much better results. So somatics is very good for that. But what we found is music, and this helped me to write Rock to Recovery. Music, playing music and singing. Now, I want to be super clear here that your brain doesn't know if you're quote unquote good. It makes no judgment.
Right.
It only matters whether you do it or not. Okay, so that's super important. So, but what we found is that music actually fires the whole brain. It's the only thing that does that. It also, when you play music or sing, it also dumps serotonin, oxytocin, and dopamine into the brain, so you get a natural high. I'm going to assume that you and I have fairly normative brain levels. So if you and I are having a bad day, and we're in the car and we do our own carpool karaoke and we sing like nobody, can hear us and don't care that we look silly, sitting in traffic, we will get a boost.
Yeah.
Right? When you sing along with the radio, you feel better, you get a boost. But that's because our neurochemical levels are going from here to here. But if you're newly sober, you're in rehab, and your brain isn't used to producing those from an internal source using to, extra, you're below the basement and you go to here and you get a natural high. So not only do we have the intended outcomes, the hoped for outcomes of it breaks up the thought process and it gives you a little natural high, but because they get naturally high, it motivates people to be in therapy longer, in rehab longer. It helps them to engage. It brings out feelings of community well-being. It helps us to get to things that people can't talk about. Very often they can sing about or write about in terms of lyrics. So there are a whole bunch of benefits to music. And that's what I wrote about in Rock to Recovery, because I had seen in this treatment center that I worked for, this organization called Rock to Recovery. Doesn't just do rock music. It's just a jazzy name.
Yeah.
But what they were doing. And so I chronicled the stories of 18 different people who have used veterans, sexual trafficking and sexual abuse survivors, trauma survivors, musicians, and people with substance abuse problems, chronicled them in this book, sharing how music has helped push forward their recovery.
Wow, that's so interesting.
Yeah. So those are the two books. Yeah.
Yeah. So, because, a lot of times I'll watch a movie and then next morning I'm waking up with some music song or something from that movie and I'm singing it to myself.
Right. But earworms until they get so annoying because you're like, oh my gosh, I can't stop singing that song to Frozen. Right. but they really, one of the reasons that we get them is our bodies do respond, our minds, I should say, respond very well to music. The other thing that our minds do neurologically, and I think it's probably why I'm an author, why I'm a storyteller at heart, because there's not a lot of differentiation in process for me, whether I'm writing fiction or nonfiction. The rules are different in terms of I can go places in fiction I can't go in nonfiction, right?
Yeah.
And there are rules of engagement if I'm doing psychological research and human subjects and review boards and those sorts of things. But the actual storytelling is similar because the brain is a storytelling machine. We have all sorts of data around us that is way too much for us to process. So our brains cherry pick and create a story, and that becomes our worldview. So one of the things really with ending addiction for good, and to a lesser extent with Rock to Recovery, is through the songwriting process, is finding a new story. Changing the stories that we tell ourselves. And I do that a fair bit in The Path to God's Promise because the protagonist, Eleanor Simitov, is a recovered alcoholic. She celebrates 20 years of recovery in the very first few pages of the book. It's not a spoiler. So why did I choose to make her an alcoholic in recovery? And it's because when I was doing my doctoral research, I did it on late stage recovery. So we call it the 10-year mark. There's a sort of idea that there's a 10-year, maybe like a 10-year curse or a speed bump that you need to be aware of. And a lot of people relapse right around between 9 and 11 years, right around 10 years. And so part of the storytelling process is to look at how did she change? Because I was so fascinated by the fact when I did my doctoral research by people in recovery, because I don't think there's a greater change in human beings from what we see in very, very late stage addiction to, long-term recovery. The people are unrecognizable in very many cases. And so I could explore that idea of personal transformation in the novel.
Yeah. Oh, wow. That's interesting. Yeah. So does that work for other kinds of trauma?
Sure. It works for so music and in terms of treatment, there are lots of things that are helpful. But what I've seen for trauma is that somatic experiencing and a change of story
Mm-hmm.
go hand in hand. They very much, we see the best results when we do both together. So there's two different ideas working here. One is, and we saw this in Van der Kolk's The Body Keeps the Score, that trauma gets stored in the body. And you can, change your stories all you want. If the trauma is still stored in the body, you're still going to get things like hypervigilance and body memories and flashbacks and dissociation and all of those sorts of things. So on the one hand, we need to move that through. And the shamans and traditional healers have known this for a long time, and they call it shaking medicine. If you see, for example, a bird that has been attacked but not killed, it will go under a rock or in a tree. It will fluff out its feathers and it will shake. And that is a way of moving through this trauma through the body. They don't hold on to it the way we might. And you see different kinds of shaking in some of the somatic experiencing. Others use a little bit different method. But along with that, we have to change the story. Because if I tell myself I'm a victim, then I'm going to act in the world as a victim. And if I have a different story, that's one of the reasons why we use the word survivor and not victim. I'm not a trauma victim, I'm a trauma survivor, right? Because if I look at the world through a survivor's lens, then I'm going to behave in the world very differently than someone who sees themselves as a victim. So these two things go together. And while I don't talk about it in these sorts of more quasi-clinical terms or a more clinical perspective in the Path to God's Promise, that is where we're coming from. How do we radically change our perspectives on what is acceptable behavior in the world around us, given climate change, and what kind of futures do we want for ourselves and others, and are we willing to make those changes? But the first change comes in your story, and we see that develop in the protagonist in the novel over time.
Cool. I always love those kinds of stories where they have examples of how that you can adopt for yourself.
Oh, sure. Well, I particularly, so I, like I said, I was suffered from alcoholism. I had a habit when I stopped drinking of starting point of at least 2 liters of hard liquor a day, which you're dying. It doesn't matter. You're dying. My liver and kidneys were giving out. And now I'm, an internationally recognized speaker and author who travels the world doing, mental health research, right? You're like, what? Like those two don't go together.
Right.
So how do we get from A to B? But when I came to drinking because it helped me deal with complex PTSD, post-traumatic stress, because I was very badly abused as a child. So when I was going through that change process before, when I was very much in the addiction and very much stuck with trauma symptoms, I loved parables and I loved the hero's journey. So I loved The Little Prince and I loved The Alchemist and books like those because, well, I realized, obviously they're fanciful. I'm not a prince who lives on an asteroid who cares for a rose, right? Like that's not my life story. But as he went to the different places and he went to the asteroid with the tippler on it, he goes to the asteroid with the businessman, and then he comes to Earth and he finds the fox and he befriends the fox, and how he changes and how he realizes that he loves this temperamental rose, that's back on his planet. I could relate to that. I could relate to that journey, and I could relate to, both the protagonist in The Little Prince and in The Alchemist, just as 2 examples. They, like so many, they grow through time. That's what the hero's journey is. You grow through time. And so I don't know that Eleanor is a hero in the same way, but because she's a prophet, she is taken through past and future potential scenarios. Like we don't really know what happened to them. Like we get some messages, but that's what archaeology is. It's like, oh, it's a best guess at what happened in the past.
Right.
Even when we have written records, we're like, I don't know, So these potential pasts and potential futures, and she gets to experience those in a very similar way that you would see in Greek mythology on, one of the hero's journeys. You see that there, or similar to, say, Dante's Inferno.
Oh gosh, it's been so long since I read any Greek mythology. Except
me
that
too.
except that I did read Medea not too long ago because I was thinking about revisiting. What now? I hadn't read that since I was in theater classes, and I, I was like, she killed her children. Why did she do that? Because I'm thinking about writing a book about all the stories that have affected me because we watched my parents made us, well, they instituted family movie night and then we talk about the stories. Well,
interesting. Okay.
So I, uh, that was one that I remember disturbed me a lot. So I read the play again and it was like, well, okay, yeah, Jason was sort of a little bit of a butthead. He was a big butthead, actually.
Right.
And I'm not sure that I would have made that choice, but back in the Greek, how could she get revenge on him?
Well, sure, and that's one of the things I think we forget is when we apply contemporary values and choices to older situations. Life is in most epochs is not valued.
Right.
It doesn't matter if you live a long time. Vikings are the great example of, go out and do, and if, today's a good day to die and all that kind of stuff. And, if you don't value life and longevity and those sorts of things, then you have a lot different choices in front of you. And, I think about Shakespeare and, how everybody has to read Hamlet in high school. And Hamlet is just like a whiny little brat. I know. And I mean, I felt that way about Luke Skywalker in the very first movie. I don't want it. It's hard. I thought Yoda should have drowned him. You're like, come on. Now, by the end of the series, when we see it's not about those men at all. It's about Princess Leia and her mother and, Rey at the end. And it's not, but in the first movie, you think it's about Luke Skywalker. And I'm like, ugh, I don't like those whiny ones. I'm Han Solo all the way. Yeah. I want the bad guy. He's a little bit of a bad guy, He's a little bit of a bad guy. I understand why Princess Leia likes him. Besides that Luke's her brother, but that's an aside.
Yes, right. Yeah. Well, yeah. So revisiting some of those old stories, it's a great way for me to kind of see how stories have evolved.
Sure. Sure.
So much. I mean, yeah. So one of the stories that I used to show in my dramatic structure class when I was teaching that at the college was Now Voyager. And it's a Betty Davis movie. I don't know if you've ever seen it.
I have not, but I know of it. Yeah.
And she goes through some therapy because at the very beginning of the movie, we see her controlling mother and controlling every aspect of her life. And she's maybe 30 now. And her mother expects her to do everything that she wants her to do and wear the clothes and blah, blah, blah. And she has a nervous breakdown at the very beginning. And her sister-in-law is so loving. She sends her off to this new kind of therapist who believes that, going out and socializing and playing games with each other and enjoying the outdoors and listening to music and putting puzzles together and, doing crafts and all that kind of stuff is helpful.
But that's exactly what we found in the research that led to ending addiction for good is that, so you mentioned going outside. Going outside is one of the best things that you can do for yourself if you're feeling anxiety, if you're feeling depression, if you are feeling fear, if you are feeling grief, is to go out and connect, because we're not meant to live these disconnected lives.
Right.
You know, there's this whole movement of these barefoot shoes, right? That you're still wearing shoes,
right.
You know, which if it's 100 degrees outside, you don't want to burn your feet. Up where I live in the Pacific Northwest, I mostly just don't wear shoes. And so I don't need the barefoot shoes because it's grass out there, you know. But you know, this is what we were meant to be connected. And we saw a, you know, extreme jump at COVID, but we were seeing a spike even before that of disconnectedness and mental health issues related to disconnectedness. I was talking to a friend of mine this morning, and I do, you know, videos on mental health for all the social medias. And I was saying to her, I said, you know, I kind of base it off the way you raise your kids, because I see the outcomes there. And one of the videos that I did was on limiting screen time. And she didn't know this at the time that I had said this to her, but she said, you know, our kids don't get screen time every day, not even every day. And when they get a screen, they share it. She has 4 children. They share one screen so that they learn that they don't always get to watch the show they want when they want for the time. And, you know, one of the things I love about her kids is they are, you know, at this point, very respectful of adults. They know how to interact with people better than I would say a lot of their peers do. And they have a concept of sharing and sometimes being bored, which of course improves actually creativity if you're not overstimulated all the time. Right. So there's a lot of benefits to these things that so what you're saying, you know, was happening with this therapist in the film, you know, from a long time ago.
42.
We're now seeing this in, as you know, de rigueur in treatment facilities.
Yeah, and as the story goes along, she learns to love herself, because that was basically what was going on. She had her mother beat down her self-esteem. We see how she is at 20 and then 30, those two comparisons. Then her mother just beat her down. And eventually when she starts to love herself, then it's easier for her to make friends. It's easier for her to fall in love. And when she falls in love, then she feels valued. She feels valued by the friends that she's made. And so when she goes home to her mom, because it's the 40s and she's living at her mom's
of course
house.
Yeah. Well, because she couldn't have lived elsewhere.
No, and they're also very wealthy. So, you know, she's able to say to her mom, when her mom tries to reassert her control, she's able to say, you know, I could go get a job. I'm not afraid. I'm not afraid to go be separate from you. And then she finds this way to balance the relationship with her mother. It's just because we don't really think of that so much now. It's like, if you don't get along, you cut off the relationship. But in this case, she learns to balance it.
I mean, women back then, you know, you can't have your own bank account, and you can't have your own, you can't get a lease by yourself, and you have to have a husband, you know, for all of that. But we still do have social expectations. One of the things I'm writing about in the book that I'm writing right now, that I've just finished a year-long 7-nation research tour, that I'm writing right now, is one of the things I recognize is I come from a family where I didn't have any of those expectations. So I didn't grow up saying, oh, when I get married and what's my wedding going to look like, and saving, you know, a hope chest or any of those things. I said, I want to be a writer and an anthropologist. I'm not an anthropologist. I'm right next door to that in the work that I do. But I said, I want to be a writer and an anthropologist. And now I'm a writer and a researcher who goes around the world working with some of the most remote populations to learn about their mental health practices, right? Related to climate change. So again, these are, my family was like, okay. When I was, I don't know, 23 or 24, no, a little older, 24, 25, something like that. I was living with my grandmother because they were elderly and could use someone to live with them. And I was living with my grandmother and grandfather. And I said to my grandma, I want to quit my job and write a book. She's like, okay. And I quit my job for a year. I didn't go back to work for a year. I didn't realize that the whole publishing process takes a long, long time. And so I'd only really had a year before I needed to actually get some income, because I paid for my own cell phone. And auto insurance. I wasn't self-supporting is my point. But yeah, I was like, okay, I want to quit but most families don't do that, but we still do have social expectations. So, I'm Jewish, and one of the expectations is you better have kids.
Right.
Which is not just a Jewish thing. It's a lot of people's things, but I'm unable to have children. I didn't want them anyway, so it worked out okay. But I wrote about that in my poetry book, Meeting God at Midnight. And I wrote about this process that you were talking about in the Betty Davis film, is this process of what does infertility feel like when you don't want children? And what does infertility feel like when you're told that's not okay? And then how do I make my way and change myself to be like, you know what? I don't care what your opinion is. You don't have to raise the children. Because see, at the end of the day, what's important to me is writing books. That is my passion. Right. And children take sacrifice.
Yes.
You have to sacrifice, even if you're a poor parent, unless you are abjectly neglecting them, right?
Yeah.
You still have to make dinner, get them to bed, get them up. Like, even if you're just a sort of mediocre going through the motions parent, there's still sacrifice. No, my books come first. And see, I would never do this. This is why I don't have children. But if you put them in that carrier thing that you put them in to take them like a car seat that goes with you. Yeah. If you take that and put that in the bathroom on the other side of the house so you can't hear them screaming and write for 7 hours, see, everybody looks down on that. It's not good for me. It's not good for the kid. And the authorities want to put you in jail for stuff like that.
Right.
Right. So I was not cut from the mommy cloth.
Right. Me either.
I was like, no. I'm the best auntie. Oh, my godchildren and the children that I'm close to, they are like, Auntie Connie is coming over. Like, they're crazy about me because I'm great when your interaction with me does not interfere with my writing.
Right.
And the people I know who are really good parents, they wanted to be parents.
Oh,
so I write about this in Meeting God at Midnight. And as an undergrad, I lived in India and Kenya, and I did research in El Salvador. So I had wonderful opportunities. But when I lived in Kenya, you really have to have children or you're going to die. You can't, choosing, especially if you're up in the encampments where people are herders, where they're semi-nomadic. If you don't have children, you are going to die. So there's no LGBTQ, everybody has children. Well, obviously some women are infertile. Now, if you're a man and you're infertile, there's things that you can do. Right. So that you don't die. But a woman who's infertile, there's a problem. But they all have multiple wives. Right. There's one man and he's going to have multiple wives. And so it is so common, if you don't have a child, one of the other wives will just give you one of theirs. They're just going to give them to you because they have enough to do and you need, and the child will think of the adoptive mother as their mother, but they all know, that's the birth mother. And there's no issue at all. And so they take care of each other in that way. And so in a book like The Path to God's Promise, my novel, I could look at those kinds of issues by going back in history.
Oh, yeah.
You see, and say, oh, wait, because this isn't in the book, but you think about, the matriarchs, right? And how Rachel couldn't have children
Right.
And Hagar
Mm-hmm.
gets although she's a concubine, a slave as opposed to a wife, but she really gets the short end of the stick once we get an offspring. Right. And how these are very complicated. The Red Tent does a beautiful job with these ideas. Right.
Mm-hmm.
But looking at that. And so I did that through poetry. And I was so tickled because this was my, first endeavor out into literature as opposed to nonfiction. And I love the fact that with poetry, the rules have been disentangled, right? You don't have to write an iambic pentameter,
right?
And you don't have to rhyme, and you don't have to. And so I could really sit with, and Meeting God at Midnight became a way for me to process when I had to have a hysterectomy. And when I had to have that hysterectomy, and the whole world is like, no, don't do it. And my doctor was like, you're 39 and a half and weren't going to have kids at this point anyway. So what? But I had to process all that. And so I got to process it through this book. And it's wonderful because now I get to share that. And I get to be unapologetic now at this point where I'm like,
right.
If you thought my mother is a really wonderful person, but I don't know that she was always the best mom. And I think if she had been in my shoes and had the choice, I don't know that she would have chosen children. Now, if you asked her, of course, I love you. I don't know that she would have chosen. I had the choice. I had the choice. I remember saying something to my grandmother once, the one that I lived with, saying to her something about children, and she had grandchildren. She was thrilled when my godson was born, and they brought him over from Australia, and she got got to see him, but she didn't need anything more than that. She's perfectly fine. I wasn't my reproduction was not her reason for being. And that is who Eleanor Simintov is. She's a middle-aged lady who doesn't have any kids, and she's like, nope, not interested.
Yeah. I mean, I'm the oldest of four. And my two younger sisters, my brother's only 2 years younger than me, but there's an 8-year gap between him and the older of my two sisters. And so the youngest one is 13 years younger than me. So when I was 10 and Heather was born, I'd come home from school and mom would pass her off to me. And I would change her diapers and feed her bottle. And then, of course, when Celeste came, it was even the same thing. And mom and dad were involved in church stuff. So, I had to stay home and babysit, make sure they got to bed. And so when Barry and I got married, I remember when we were being counseled, oh, you have to decide if you want children. And not both of us said, we don't know if we want to decide right now. And then, we tried to get pregnant, never happened. And then we took a trip circumnavigating the globe. And when we were in Greece, we were stuck in Olympia because Papandreou died. This was 96.
Okay.
And he had been the prime minister during World War II. So it was like the whole country shut down.
Yep.
And we're stuck in Olympia. And we're swimming around in this pool at a restaurant that was owned by a friend of the Australian lady that owned the hotel where we were staying. And so they'd let us go swim there during the day. And, we just decided. I don't remember it always happens this way. We were just talking about children, and it was like we just decided we weren't going to have kids because he's an artist. I'm an artist in a different way. And we had these things that we wanted to do. And I love children. I have worked with children since I was in high school, taking care of them, working at daycare centers and Montessori schools and child development centers. And I taught school but I didn't, one of the kids in Douglas, Arizona, where I taught, that was the last high school I taught at, said, how come you don't have kids? And I said, because I love children, but then I get to go home and have
I don't want him at my house. That's how I'm like,
a quiet
it's
evening.
great. I like, actually, that's not true. I do not like babies. I do not want anything small, crying, pooping on itself. Can't tell me what's wrong. From the time they're about 3.5 or 4, where they're starting potty trained and communicative and whatnot. But if you're a jerk, I ain't got time for that. I don't want those sort of daily things. And I have a lot of friends actually who don't have children. A surprising number of people who are childless by choice. But when I see my friends who did want children, there's a beautiful bond and something that I'll never experience with all those things. But I also see when, it's the end of the day and they are absolutely exhausted and frustrated and all the things. And I'm like, yeah, kids can come over to my house for a couple of hours. And then beyond that, you need to go home. Like, I don't want you messing up my stuff. And like, an artist, like I've got my books and I've got my stuff around and don't touch it and don't break things. And I'm just not interested.
Yeah.
Not interested.
All of my siblings have children, but my youngest sister's the only one that they lived here for a while, and we know that niece and nephew the best. And we loved being with them, and they even now want us, oh, they're coming over, yay,
well, I have the same thing. I was just adopted into an iwi, into a New Zealand family, a Maori family. And I mean, those auntie, which part of their culture is any older woman is an auntie. But I love it. I got the last few, New Zealand was one of the places I was doing research. And the last couple of nights I was in New Zealand, I got a hotel. I switched hotels and I got a hotel near the airport that had a swimming pool so that they could come over and swim. And they're like, Auntie, and swimming pool.
Yeah, right.
And that's perfect. But these are choices that I have because of the culture and the time and the place that I live in. And so, I explore that because I realize it's not the norm. But I have been very, I don't want to say pleasantly surprised because it sounds like I'm making a judgment. Surprised in the sense that I didn't expect it. But when I go and work with these really remote populations, I'm always surprised that there's never expressed to me anyway negative judgment that I didn't want children. Right. Surprised sometimes, like you didn't want any and you didn't have to have. Like that's interesting to them, but never like there's something wrong with you. Right. And when I was in college and living in Kenya, there was a man in a nomadic tribe who wanted to marry me so I could be his second wife, not second in consecutive, second of however many he was going to have. I thought he was teasing me. I thought he was just flirting and teasing, but I went and met his wife. And he was the youngest of the elders, and he had one wife at the time, and she was pregnant, had an infant and a 2-year-old, and she was my age. I had just turned 20. I think she was 19. Anyway, she was my age roughly, and we were talking, and he said, "How many children do you want?" And I said, "None." And I said to him, "How many children do you want?" And he said, 10. And I said to her, "How many children do you want?" And she said, "Well, I guess if you're not having any, I want 10. And that was the moment I was like, wait a minute, this guy's not joking. And I was like, whoa. I mean, I changed the whole conversation then, because you have to figure if you have 10 children, half of them are going to die. That was the, child mortality rate that we were working with at that time. Half of them are going to die, and half of them that are remaining are going to be girls who are going to go off to someone else's family. So if you are going to have any livelihood in your old age, you need at least 2 sons to stay.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So if I'm not going to have any, she has to have 10.
Yeah.
And so it's a different cultural perspective. And I got to look at that really closely in the Path to God's Promise, because one of the things that I have Eleanor do is I have her move through time and space. And so we go back to the Exodus. We go back to the time where Israelites are sacrificing their children to Moloch, one of the gods. We go into contemporary time in South Africa, in Namibia, actually. We go into contemporary time in Kenya, into one of the slums, and see a child interacting with a woman who is dying of AIDS. We get to see these different cultural perspectives so that Eleanor gets to see what I know from my research, that we create the world we live in through our stories. And if we create a different story, we create a different outcome. The Hindus say that Brahma is dreaming this. This is all a dream. The Matrix, right, says that this is an illusion. Modern consciousness studies tells us the same thing. So, for example, solidity is an illusion. We know this, that this is mostly, I see it as solid. It feels solid, but it's mostly empty space with electrons, buzzing around. And when I'm sitting in this chair that I'm sitting on, right, some of the electrons from my butt go into my pants, and some of the electrons from my pants go into the chair and get changed. This is an illusion. If that's true, if the Hindus and the Buddhists and the consciousness studies and all the people are right, if this is an illusion, then the story I create about it is real. That's why I say there's not a lot of difference between nonfiction and fiction, because they both have the ability to change my perspective and my lived experience if I tell the story well. And that's why, as an author, I try to be the best storyteller that I can be.
That's so great. I love it. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, even in our culture, my mom, at one point said, "Oh, you'll be so sorry if you don't have children, and I love my children." Now, I never would have told my mom, she died in February. I never would have told her that part of the reason why I didn't have children was because I took care of her children.
Sure.
And I mean, she worked. She needed to work because my dad had a job where sometimes he got laid off. And and they did church stuff, and so they were gone a lot of evenings. But she just thought that was my job, and
I was very well. I know people who still do that, but I was very fortunate. My mother made it very clear that me having children was about her. She didn't care if I had children or not. She wanted grandchildren. And my brother was 35 or 36 before he had his one and only. There's only the two of us. My brother and I are different from your story in that there's 2.5 years between us. We are Gen X all the way. We were the locked out, run around, do your thing. So I had farm responsibilities. I had chores, probably more than a child should have had. Although I do absolutely believe that children should have responsibilities in the home. I think that's very important. But, so I didn't get that guilt trip from her. She didn't give me that, oh, you're going to be, she gave me a guilt trip only one time in my life. And that was when I was in high school, and she really pushed me to go to prom. And I was like the goth kid. Like there was, no, not interested. Yeah. And she's like, you're going to regret that you didn't go to prom. And you know what? I'm going to be 52 this year, and I don't at all regret that I didn't go to prom. Yeah. Like, I didn't dream about the dress. For 8th grade we had 8th grade graduation back then. And for 8th grade graduation, the girls were supposed to wear formals, which was ridiculous because the boys wore jeans and a sweater.
Oh yeah.
You know, but we were supposed to wear formals, and our color scheme was pastel.
Oh,
So all the
yeah.
little blonde girls, they had their, you know, their yellow
Yeah.
dresses and their pink dresses and whatever. And I am not kidding. I looked like the Bride of Frankenstein. I
love it.
wore a black gown that had this big drape in front. It looked like a choir dress, actually. Had this big drape in front. It was polyester. I wore my hair up. And I got nervous, and I wore pretty much white pancake makeup anyway, but I kept putting baby powder on top of it because I was a little nervous. It was the first time, you know, I'd done anything like that. So I had white. So I, except for not having a white streak, I looked like the Bride of Frankenstein. And I remember our house burned down, so I don't have the picture anymore. But I remember a picture was taken, and I was standing next to my friend Medea. Of all people, that's her name is Medea. But I was standing next to Medea, and she was really tall and very fair skinned and blonde, and she was in this pretty yellow dress, and I'm like next to her, like I totally look like the Bride of Frankenstein. And it was funny because one of the mothers who was helping with the, you know, decorations and all that, she came to my mom and said, I'll buy her a dress if she won't wear black, because I asked for a black corsage and a black ribbon and all the things, and she was like, I'll buy her a dress. And my mom's like, you misunderstand, we can afford a dress, like that's not the problem. She won't wear it, like she's gonna wear black because that's all she's gonna wear. But yeah, no, it's fortunately from back in the day, right, these things aren't digital, they didn't live on the web, so when the house burned down, the picture's gone. But I did look like the Bride of Frankenstein. I was like, and I was grumpy too. I was like, you know, so yeah. But that was it. That's the only time my mom ever said anything. She's like, don't you want to go to the prom? But my mom was good. You know, my mom, she, you know, I think all parents do live a little bit vicariously through their children to some extent, you know, even if that's just wanting to have better than they had. My mother wanted she wanted me to go to the prom. She wanted me to, she was like, don't you want to be a cheerleader? And I was like, no. But we live so far out of town, it would have been hard for her to drive me, you know? So that she didn't push that too hard. I was like, no, I don't want to jump around for some boys. Yay, boys playing football. No, that's not interesting. And she wanted me to be a barrel racer. I had horses. I showed horses in 4-H. And we didn't have any money, so I had this wild mare. And after 4-H practice, I was the only one at that time in my club doing barrel racing. So after regular practice, I was riding this horse, and I'm pulling her up like crazy because I'm scared to death. And my 4-H leader is shouting at me, let her run. And I'm like, I scream as I'm trying to pull her up, because she'd just take the bit and go. I screamed as I'm trying to pull her up, I don't like to go fast. I get done with the run. She goes, put your horse away. I do not know what she said to my mom. All I heard was, if she doesn't like to go fast, either the horse or she or someone else is going to get hurt. I don't know what happened after that. I never barrel raced again.
Oh,
That was the end of it. Whatever she said to my mom, I never barrel raced again, because my mom had wanted to have a horse, and she didn't get to start riding until she was in her mid to late 30s, you know, and she never, when you start that late, you're just not going to develop. That's something you have to develop as a child.
Right. Yeah.
You know, like I tried to learn how to surf. No. Well, my surfer friends are very funny. They're like, you're very good sitting on the board and getting the board out. I'm like, yeah, because this center of gravity is the same center of gravity as riding a horse. But when I'm supposed to jump up, now my center of gravity is way up here, related to where the movement is.
Yeah.
Into the soup, into the drink.
Right. Yeah.
You know, so I get it. But yeah, I get to the fun thing about fiction is I get to explore all of that. Right. And the great thing about nonfiction is I have chosen, and this is a choice, I have chosen not to write traditional academic books because I work in the field of mental health, particularly coming out of addiction. People don't have time to wait for things to go through academic review boards and then get accepted at peer-reviewed journals. And then I have to, talk about it at conferences and all of that stuff. And I founded my own research institute, so I'm not beholden to someone for tenure.
Right.
So I don't have to get certain numbers of publications in journals of this kind of status and all of that stuff. I don't have, and I made this choice so that I could get the information directly to people, because in the United States, when you're talking about the medical system, we're one of the few nations in the world that has a for-profit medical system. Now, whatever you believe about capitalism, social, whatever, I think it's dangerous for our health to have a for-profit medical system. And so, especially with addiction, most people can't afford the type of care that it takes, because it just takes time. We know what really good addiction treatment is. We talk about it in Ending Addiction for Good. I talk about it in Rock to Recovery. We know what good addiction treatment looks like. The problem is that we've known for more than 50 years now, 50 years, that good addiction treatment, to give someone a foundation upon which to have abstinence, you're talking about a year of support with wraparound services, not a year in inpatient. But this, we're going to detox you, because you don't even get 28 or 30 days anymore. Remember those movies? You don't even get that. You get detox, and then you get stepped down to intensive outpatient treatment, IOP, right? An intensive outpatient program. And if you fail out of that, which usually means a relapse, well, then you can go back to residential for a certain number of days. The most likely time to die from an overdose is right after you failed out of treatment, right? After you've gotten out of treatment and you're in that IOP stage, right? Or just a little bit after that. That's because your body is not accustomed to the drug anymore, but your brain still thinks. So if I started drinking in that right after, in my first 30 days, my brain thinks I still drink 2 liters of alcohol a day. Well, if you're 20, you might get away with that for a couple of minutes. But if you're taking heroin or Dilaudid or fentanyl or whatever, you're dead. That's dead. Right. And so, but that's great for the insurance companies, because then they don't have to pay anymore, because treatment is expensive. So we look at, this, and we see this, it takes time. Takes time. And so I get to explore, if you have time, then what are these changes that you make? And part of those changes, and I talk about this both in the fiction and in the nonfiction, part of those changes are to how you see yourself. I was doing an interview, a written interview for the Path to God's Promise, and they asked me, one of the questions was, what was it like when you first started writing? And did anyone encourage you? And I actually, across from me, you can't see it from this stage, but I have a memorial to a friend of mine who I met in a 12-step program, and he was a best-selling novelist, and he encouraged me to write. But when I was 30 days or 90 days sober, I didn't, who wants to hear my story? Who wants to hear what I have to say? I don't even believe that I have something to say. And now I'm like, I read some of my stories. I'm like, wow, there's a point to this. You may not like it. You might not agree with it, but it's going to be well written, at least. I mean, I got to at least give that. And one of the things that I've learned is, I'm a doctor and a blah, 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 blah. Like I have a resume, I'm an expert in this area. And if you ask me a question in this sliver, I have a lot of insights. But then you ask a question over here, I don't know. We better go look at, Dr. Google, because I don't know. We better, my ice machine stopped working. It's making ice, but it's not dispensing. So the turner isn't working something. So I emptied it. I turned it off and I turned it back on. I emptied it to make sure that there wasn't a piece of ice blocking it that had gotten stuck. Okay, so that's not the problem. And then I turned it off and I turned it back on and I let it remake some ice. And that's not the problem. All right, well, now you've exhausted my area of expertise.
Right, yeah.
You know, is there something blocking it from turning? No. Did turning it off and turning it back on work? No. Now you got to get someone who knows about it.
Right.
Because I don't know.
Yeah.
And if we can be humble, I think that's the beauty of these books, because the hardest thing about writing, once I felt like I had a story to tell, or I had the audacity to take up space, is what I like to call it. That I'm like, yeah, no, I have something to share here. The hardest thing is having the vulnerability to feel the feelings of the characters, and whether the book is fiction or nonfiction. Because remember, I'm not writing academic, so I'm not writing from a distance.
Right.
I get in there and I tell these stories as stories so that the public can relate to them. They're not filled with jargon. And if it can help you, because like I said, Saturday is 26 years of recovery for me, and I am completely symptom-free from trauma symptoms for over 2 years. I didn't even know that was possible. 3 years, I guess now. I moved to the house that I'm in now because it's a writer's retreat and it's kind of far away from everything. And I could just be here by myself, not triggered, and write my books. Never thought that I could have complete recovery from trauma. So if I can help someone else get there, I want to. But to get there, I have to dive into the feelings of every character in the book, and I have to feel it. Some people say it's like bleeding on the page. That's the, expression that I use. Somebody else, I can't remember if it was Stephen King or Neil Gaiman, but, shitting razor blades was their expression. I can't remember which one it was. But I'm like, yeah, I don't know that I would quite go that vulgar, but yeah, that's exactly what it is. And I think that's really still the most difficult thing for me. And that's why I work with an editor, because what I think is on the page, what I think I've felt, may not be there, but I fill it in from my own imagination.
Yeah.
So I work with an editor and I'm like, okay, I'll take it to her and I'll say, all right, I know there's something wrong with it. Like that's what I did with The Path to God's Promise. I said, I know there's something wrong with it, and I'm not clear on what it is. By the way, it's also 20,000 words short of being a book. And which was true because I had cut 20,000 words because I didn't, because it was flat. And Eleanor was whiny. She sounded just like Luke Skywalker. I don't want it. I was like, I ain't writing a book about you, lady. If you're going to whine the whole time, you're not my protagonist. And she's not that way now. But she said to me, well, because you jump in the book from the middle. And I was like, well, because it is the first 20,000 words that I cut. So that doesn't surprise me. But she's like, no, you have to tell us and let us experience who Eleanor is. That's why it took me 10 years to write this book. Rock to Recovery. It was 3 months of research and then another 6-8 months of writing. We actually held the book for publication because of COVID. So it came out a little, after that. So it was like, 2.5 years instead of 1.5 years to get the book out. But the fiction, because I didn't want to feel the feelings, took 10 years.
Yeah, right.
Took 10 years.
Yeah, I kind of understand that. Although I was an actress for a while, and being a director, I kind of get. I guess I can kind of feel it, but I'm not sure I can. I'm not I've not always been a writer, and I didn't take creative writing. I took playwriting classes. So how do you get that on the page? Because I'm used to having it, be my body language and my voice and my,
See, I couldn't do that. So I have friends, of course, who are, actors, and stage performing musicians. And, when I have to do a red carpet, boo.
Yeah.
I don't want to go out there and so I can do it because I'm here and it's an internal process.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
And if I get upset, who sees me? My dog and my cat, right? Like, but I see them, the stage where I'm like, you can embody that in
Mm-hmm.
front of other people. Like in terms of that, like I would say, because I had so much trauma, and one of the things with trauma is you keep everything in. So I still am not very expressive. One of the things I had to learn, or I got to learn by having somatic experiencing, as I said to my somatics practitioner, is there was a time I knew I loved my godchildren, but I couldn't feel it when they were in the room with me.
Mm-hmm.
I was shut down. I went through the motions and acted like I cared about them because I did. But then when they left the room or left on an airplane or I left on an airplane, I'm a wreck. Like I'm emotionally heartbroken because I couldn't really express the fullness of my feelings with them. What happens when I'm writing a book is, I set aside, I'm supposed to write in the mornings. I write from, it's supposed to be 9:00, but it's usually more like 9:30 because the dog pukes on the carpet or, has to go out or something like that. But it's supposed to be from 9 to 1. That's the window. But and it starts out like that for, I'd say 5 to 7 days. And I don't take days off. When I'm actually working on a manuscript, it's every day. I mean, if I have to go to the doctor or something, then, you take that time off like you would from a job, but it's 7 days. What ends up happening is the characters really start speaking to me and I sink into those characters, and whether they're fiction or nonfiction is irrelevant. I sink into their emotions. And then when I'm done writing for the day, because there comes a certain point where I'm not putting anything productive on the page, I very often have to call someone and be like, I am devastated. I am just, because even when the scene's done, it's difficult to crawl out of that for me, and so, it's funny now that I hadn't thought of this before, but I think everything I write has at least a little bit of a hopeful ending. I was thinking about Margaret Atwood. I love her work, especially I love the Mad Adam trilogy, Oryx and Crake, one of my favorite books. And but boy, it just starts out bad and gets worse. In a lot of her worlds and a lot of her scenarios, it's like, whoa, and so I aspire to her world building. But I'm like, I might have a little bit more of a hopeful view. But I think that's because, and I don't know very much of her biography at all, other than she, lives in the great gunless North, right? She's Canadian. But I think because of everything that I've been through, I'm like, but maybe we'll dodge the bullet. Because in a certain way I did. Because people with my history, we are overdoses and suicides. That's how we end. And we end very young. And that's why Gabor Mate's books, the Hungry Ghosts, he works in addiction just here in Vancouver, just right across the border from me in Canada. And but one of the things he talks about, he's like, I understand when people don't want to get sober. They don't want that kind of absence. They're not looking, because if I had known how absolutely horrific it would be to feel the feelings, I don't know that I would have done the somatic experiencing. But I wanted it bad enough because I didn't want my dad to win. That has always been my thought process. You don't get to take any more from me. Right? I'll show you. I'll be healthy and happy and an internationally best-selling author, and F you, right? So I know how ugly it gets. And to intentionally go in there, it is a bummer. It's a bummer.
Yeah.
But I'll do it for the art. I'll do it for the art. I'll do it for the work. I couldn't do it on the stage. If you asked me to get up there and feel those feelings every night in front of a Broadway, no.
Yeah.
I'm going to be the reader on the side who's going through the script and when you forget your line.
Right. Or the stage manager or something.
Something like that. Something like that. Something like that.
Yeah. I mean, my friend who is a theater professional who taught with me, his name is Dave Dahl, before I gave everything over to him, used to tell the students, if you get into a role that just you have a hard time getting rid of, he said, my technique is just to say, my name is Dave Dahl. My name is Dave. And just repeat that to yourself until you start to feel like yourself again.
I like that.
Which I went, that is so simple, but effective. Because, I have had those roles that were difficult to get rid of.
Sure.
And so, and we always used to say to our acting students, we don't want you to be like Heath Ledger.
That's exactly who I was thinking of, is that it's very difficult. And that's the problem, I think, with writing, is that if I come out of the book is the best way I can describe it. If I come out of the story, I don't know how long it will take me to get back in. So I dive in and I do it and I do it and I do it and I do it till it's done. One of the good things about Rock to Recovery was that it's 18 stories. And so I didn't have to stay in it for so long. And actually, meeting God at midnight, this book was interesting. So I was very, very depressed. And my rabbi said to me, he said, you're a writer, send me some writing every day. I was like, dude, I write books and I write nonfiction. At that time, I had just finished the first edition of Ending Addiction for Good. I said, what am I going to send you? He's like, I don't know, but I expect writing from you every day. Well, I could write a poem in a day. It didn't matter if it was bad. Again, I don't get into judgments about that. That's irrelevant to me. Because it's mostly bad. I mean, that's why they call it the shitty first draft.
Right. Yeah.
Right. It is bad. And I don't care because it's the anomaly when it's good. Right. Yeah. You're like, wow, that was really good. But most of the time I'm like, okay, fix this paragraph and then fix this paragraph. Now fix this paragraph. But with a poem, right, I could come out of that process. Again, that's probably why The Path to God's Promise took 10 years, because I'd come out of it and it was so horrible at some points. I'd come out of it for a year and not be able to pick up the manuscript again. Yeah. So that's why with this new project that I'm working on, there's a research aspect to it, but it's going to read like a memoir. And so the things that I have to, the emotions that I have to dive into are not as problematic because I'm not in that state of serious depression, but also I have so much support. Now I understand what the process is. I have so much support. So like my friends in Australia, I'll call them up and be like, this is terrible. Well, the time zone difference is difficult. And so if they can't talk right then, because very often they'll be at work or on their way home or at, cricket practice or whatever they're at. And they'll say, do you need me? And if the answer was ever yes, and it hasn't been to date, but if it was ever yes, I have every confidence they would drop everything and have my attention. I would have their attention. That is even very often enough. Just be like, I am in it and miserable. And, they're like, do you need to talk to me right now? And I'll be like, no, I can wait till after basketball. Okay, great. Then I will call you in 3 hours, whatever it is, but that's how I I get out of it.
Yeah, that's great.
Yeah, is
That's
to
great.
have that
Yeah.
support. And one of the things that is taught to us is mindfulness, right? In addiction and trauma treatment.
Mm-hmm.
Whatever story is going through my mind, whatever scenario that is, it's not happening now.
Right.
Like if I'm actually having, a filling put in a tooth, okay, well, that might hurt. So I can have, a little bit of anxiety about that, right? Or if my loved one passed last week, I'm going to feel grief. Those are normal. That's because that's actually part of this life experience right now. If I'm going to my friend Shiva Minion, of course I'm going to feel sad.
Right.
Okay. But if I'm worried about, is a traditional publisher going to pick up my book, and are they going to do it with an advance, and blah, 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 and where's the funding from the next project of my research institute going to come from? I'm going to make myself crazy. And none of that is real right now. Right now, you and I are having a lovely conversation.
Yeah.
And when we're done, I'm going to walk my little dog. And then I'm going to, finish a project that I was working on. And then tomorrow, a friend is going to come over and I'm going to work on a grant while she takes down 2 limbs from the tree so that the front of my house, the flowers in front of my house, get more light and are prettier and smell nicer because they're going to get more light. None of that has to do with publishing houses. None of that has to do with institutional funding. None of that has to do with anything. It's all so I can live in that story because all I have is now.
Right.
Even when this really helped me with trauma, even when I'm in the trauma, like experience, and they're triggered, that's not something that I am trying. That's not something that, that I'm bringing on myself. It just gets triggered.
Right. Yeah.
That also is not happening now.
Right. Yeah.
And so if I can recognize I'm here, I'm right. You see 2 things and you smell one thing and what are, 4 sounds a year, whatever the thing is. But I put my feet on the ground and I am here and I am now. And those things, they're just a story. That doesn't mean that I don't plan. That doesn't mean that I don't write grants. Of course I do. I have a grant calendar and there are things that are due by different times. But if I'm in the middle of writing the grant, then I'm in the action. I'm not afraid of whether I'm going to get the grant or not. I'm just focused on writing the grant. I'm here in that process. And that gets rid of so much of that. And so the hard thing is that, when you're writing, books where there are massacres or there are, natural disasters. I wrote a scene about a forest fire is based on in the Path to God's Promise, based on the Paradise fires in California. But when I'm writing about being in the car racing through the flames and you don't know if you're going to outrace them and you don't know if there's a car stopped in front of you because you can't see, but you're still going 65. I'm actually feeling that. And that's the hardest part for me.
Yeah.
Is because when I'm done, I'm the person at the homeless shelter, right? At the emergency shelter that they've set up. Like, that's how I feel. I'm like, we made it through that. Yeah. And so then it's hard to be like, okay, well, now I'm going to roast asparagus for dinner. That's the only time I actually wish that I was married is when I've gone through that and I'm like,
yeah,
I have to do laundry now. Like, no.
Yeah, really. Yeah,
no, that's not it. And unfortunately, I live really far out, so it's not like you're going to have a housekeeper. Oh, I don't have that kind of money anyway, but you're going to have a housekeeper, a cook to come do that for you. It's like, oh yeah, I have to run my life, Yeah, or you come out of it and you're like, oh my gosh, I have 40 minutes to get to the post office to get this, book mailed off to a reader or something like that. It's like, okay, yeah. That's the hard part. That's the hard part, but I love it. I wouldn't change it because the art, like I said, the art is so important to me.
Yes.
There's nothing that I value more. And I value it because I'm certainly not the only one who does this, but I tell stories well enough that I can change someone's life. And that's why I was, put here. Like, that's my passion. It is to tell these stories. And so if I can, especially if you have, addiction or trauma or mental health issues in your background, I'm like, whether it's my fiction, my nonfiction, the poetry within fertility, to say, hey, your life doesn't have to look this way, right? Be in this, for it to be good. Like my life is so untraditional and I absolutely love it. And I love, people coming up, they're like, are you home? I'm like, well, yeah, I just finished my research tour. See, to me, it seems intuitive. I'm like, I just finished my research tour, so I'm going to be home for the rest of the year. Like, I'm going to go visit my mom in Oregon, but like, I'm here, like I'm writing my book. And they're like, well, we never know. Cause you're, I've been on more for the research tour. I've been on more trips in the first half of the year than most people go on in their lifetime. Like, oh yeah, well, though I was just in the jungles of Ecuador, and then I flew over to be with the Maori on the North Island of New Zealand after, interviewing some LGBTQ individuals in Australia, because I'm looking at everyday bravery. What does it look like to be brave? In your day, not running into burning buildings and stuff like that. So I jetted up. People like, you were in the jungles of the Amazon? Well, yeah, because that's where the people live. So that's where I go.
Yeah.
And I get in there and they're like, oh my gosh, lady, like I tell them all the time. It's so funny. So I tell them, I said, listen, first of all, I play dumb. I play like I don't speak Spanish. And I always take a translator with me because my Spanish is mediocre. I can get by. I can certainly, order food and, take directions and understand probably 85% of a conversation. But if you're doing research, it has to be perfect. Like I have to really understand absolutely every word. So I take a translator with me to make sure. It's also, some of the things are recorded, some are not, depends on what I'm doing, but to make sure that I'm understanding. But I play dumb. And I always say to the people, to my guides, because I always, take indigenous guides to take me in and introduce me to people. I say, listen, do not introduce me as the doctor who is writing a book. And invariably they introduce me as the doctor who's writing a book, right? Because then the people lie and because, even though I'm Jewish, which isn't really white, but I look to them like a white lady from the United States,
right.
And there's a power and a doctor and there's a power differential and all of that stuff. So they lie and tell me what they think I need to hear. But I go and live with them, and they're always so funny because I'm heavy set and I'm out in the older and I'm in the jungle and I'm too hot and my translator's too hot and we're struggling to get by, and then they will caretake you. I've never been to a community where they don't want you to die on their watch.
Right. Yeah.
I was in Morocco at Ramadan, and I was in a rug shop. I wanted to buy a carpet. Actually, the carpet that is under my feet right now is a carpet I bought on that trip at that shop. But I walked in and I'm sweating and I'm red-faced and it's so hot. And they put me immediately under the air conditioner and they said, water, tea, cookies. And I'm like, well, it's Ramadan. I'm not going to. And he was like, A, you're not Muslim. I'm like, okay. So the rules don't apply to me. And he's like, B, he looks at me, he gets right in my face. He's like, it's very bad for business if you die in my shop. And I was like, also true. I will have water and tea and cookies. Thank you so much. So I've always found people on the whole, and again, I'm not going to go to, someplace where they're not, where they're known not to be that kind and welcoming, but always exceed my expectations. Anyway, so I'm in the jungles of Ecuador and I'm trying to make relationships so that people will tell me their real experiences. And we were taken to a women's cooperative and they made us fish. And I think it was piranha actually, but they made this fish and we put it in the, leaves and they put it on the fire and it's going to be like an hour to cook or something. Anyways, we're taken off to the school. I have an hour to kill is the point. We're taken off to the school and the women are following as we're taken to the school. And I speak to the principal and he says, we need books in English, Spanish, and Quechua. We have no library here. I said, okay. He said, we also need some school supplies. I said, okay. I said, here's what you're going to do. I said, the lodge that I'm staying at? He said, yeah. It's a birder's lodge. People go to look at parrots. That's not why I was there, but that's really what it's there for. I said, you put on your website, it's owned by the tribe. I said, you put on your website and in all of your incoming materials that the school, I said, Quechua, I can't help you. I said, but you say the school needs a library for all reading levels of English books in English and Spanish. And it's tons and tons of Europeans, not just Americans, tons and tons of Europeans. I said, I guarantee you, they'll all throw one or two of their favorite books from whatever reading level. And within a year to a year and a half, you'll have a full library at all reading levels of books in English and Spanish. I said, also tell them that you need school supplies. I'll throw a pack of pens and a pad of paper or whatever, one of those little notebooks. I'll throw that in my suitcase. I said, here's the other thing you're going to do. I said, when you're changing money, you can't change coins. You can only change bills. I said, you put a box at the dock where the canoes come up. You get there, but it's like 700 hours by canoe to get there. It's not quite, I exaggerate, but it's what it feels like when you're sitting on your butt in a little canoe for 6 hours to get to the thing. Anyway, I said, you put just a box and you say all the change goes to the school. We'll all throw our change in. I said, and they're like, how did you know to do that? I said, because every airliner in Europe does that. They say, put your money in this little envelope and we'll give it to UNICEF. I was like, I'll always give the little change to the kids. The only place where I didn't put it in an envelope was in Spain. In Madrid, they had a big bowl that you threw your money in. So that way they could take I guess they'd take bills in the envelopes too. Well, the women overheard that. They overheard this conversation. Well, now I'm not the doctor who is writing a book and just wants to take from them. I'm someone who actually cares about their community. Because listen, they're going to participate or they're not. I'm already in the Amazon jungle and I'm going to have my experience and they're going to participate or not.
Right.
But I'm there because I care that people in these remote communities get better mental health care because of the climate changes. And what I've noticed, because I'm not a specialist in one area, I'm a generalist in all areas. I've noticed that all these different indigenous groups have very similar practices. They look different in how they manifest, but the practices are similar. Anyways, these women overhear the conversation. By the time I get back to eat my fish, the shaman has been called and is on his way. The midwife is the next day going to talk about women's health with me separate from the shaman. And she's also an herbalist. They took me to the garden where the women's cooperative grows their medicinal herbs. And the shaman is teaching me how to make ayahuasca because I had one conversation with a principal and showed, no, I actually care about your community. That's why I write my books the way I write them, because I want you to have, you, the reader, to have access to this information. And I'm just not going to play the university game. And if someday a university wanted to hire me, well, that would be nice because it's a nice, income and benefits and all those things. But I can't jump through those hoops. It's just, to me, disingenuous with my vision and my process, which is why I started my own research institute so that I could do this on my own.
Right. Oh, wow. Wow, what a great conversation.
Well, I'm so glad to be able to speak with you.
Oh, yes. And thanks for contacting me. So I'm going to give you one last shot. Do you have anything else you want to share?
No, but if you want to learn more about me, it's ConstanceScharff.com. You can Google me. I'm on all the different socials. And my latest book, The Path to God's Promise, is available by special order anywhere books are sold or on Amazon. And my poetry books and my nonfiction books, they're available on Amazon or linked to Amazon through my website.
Yes, and I will have all of that in the show notes.
Perfect.
So thank you so much for being my guest.
Thank you for having me. I really appreciate the opportunity.
I hope you enjoyed the show. If you like what you heard, please share it with a friend and give us a rating and/or review on your favorite podcast app. It will help people find us. I I invite you to join my Patreon community at patreon.com/storypower, all one word. Or if you like, you can subscribe to Story Power on Apple Podcasts. It's my aim to build a community where we discuss the stories we love and talk about what we learned from them. I offer extra audio content and story suggestions to my patrons on both platforms. Remember, as Philip Pullman said, after nourishment, shelter, and companionship, stories are the thing we need most in the world. Let's spread the story love. Until next time, this is Lucinda Sage-Midgorden. Thanks for listening.